Welcome to Module 3, Gamification and Game-Based Learning. In this module, we're going to talk about the evolution of digital games in K-12 virtual education, and then begin to explore how you might use some games or gamification in your own virtual education. So as teachers, we've been using games for a long time. We've used physical games in our physical classrooms. We have students interact with one another and play games as a way to learn not only socialization skills and interaction, but often the consequences of choices made in somewhat real-life situations, or even in hypothetical situations that help them, appeal to real-life opportunities that they may be faced with. So we've used these for a long time. And then came the video game. How, though, and for a long time there's been a lot of debate, do we take that physical game and that video game and turn them into something that's really effective in the classroom? Students love video games. Even if it's a simple game like an Angry Birds on a phone, or a more complex game that students play on gaming devices, they love them and they're learning things from them. Now, what exactly they're learning is often open for debate, although there is quite a bit of research on how games really help students learn anything from interacting and problem solving to very, very specific, tangible skills. It is important to think about how can we improve our own virtual teaching by bringing in some of the more current games and gamification approaches. So gamification. Gamification is about taking game-like principles, things that we do in games, and applying them to lessons or applying them to any kind of setting. So gamification, you actually can gamify anything. It doesn't have to be education. But it's about taking those principles of games and applying them to teaching. This is different than games themselves, and we're going to separate these two because we're going to talk about examples in each of these categories. But this is separate than games themselves. Games are the actual interaction, the actual experience, the actual play. And then there's even serious games, which are those actual games that are mimicking very real-life situations. So for example, they're not quite simulations. So for example, a game might be playing a race car driving game through some sort of game console. A serious game could be using an aircraft simulator to learn how to fly an airplane. So that's a skill. It can still have game aspects to it. You can still win or lose or crash or fly better or get more points, but it's about a very particular skill. And now all three of these, gamification, games, and serious games, can all have an impact on your teaching and can be incorporated in the types of activities that you're using, particularly at a distance. Now, for a long time, digital game-based learning has been studied. In fact, Mark Prensky is sort of the father of digital game-based learning. And he's talked a lot about how there's true educational and lesson value in games, as well as the importance of the engagement that comes with games. It's okay to do something that students feel like is fun. They can still learn from that. Fun doesn't mean you can't learn, and that's what Mark Prensky and many people after him have researched and studied. Of course, you want to make sure that the game is designed and focused in the right way so that it does accomplish your learning objectives, but that it's okay that it can be fun. Now, the learning theory tells us this as well. Particularly if you're creating classrooms and lessons around active learning or problem-based learning, social learning, even collaborative learning, games can really feed into this. It's a great way for students to have independence in their experiences. They can path and grow and adapt based on a game. They can collaborate with one another and work with one another, and they're very hands-on. They can be center at that game. So learning theory actually says that games can be okay and gamification can be okay, depending on how we use it. Now, there's a couple of different types of games that we may want to use, or games and gamification in general. There's online games. And this includes serious games. So these are things that you could have students go access online through a computer, a laptop, or even a mobile device. There's also apps that are specific for mobile devices like tablets and phones, or even mobile gaming tools where students can play specific games geared towards the use of that particular device. And then finally, there's the do-it-yourself and make-it-your-own category. This is where you can either gamify something that you're already doing in your class, or you can actually encourage students to use their own authoring environments, things like Minecraft and Scratch, where they can create their own games and then play their own games. Now, the strengths of using games in virtual K-12 education is that it does encourage and promote interactivity and student engagement. Kids like games. There's some fun centered in that. They don't all have to be heartily competitive. They can be just really valuable in how students interact or even path themselves in their learning. And there are rewards. And students today are often seeking feedback very frequently and often, and like rewards, even just to be acknowledged that they're progressing. Rewards are embedded in games quite often, which can be a really good thing. Games can encourage students to be creative and think for themselves and be at the center of that game. And they can encourage skill development, and especially in scenarios or simulation kind of experiences. Some of the challenges with using games is that it's hard to find good games, and they can be really time-consuming to create your own game. They can also be really time-consuming to implement, and students can get really immersed in the game, and the actual learning activity can take longer using a game than if you would have just done the learning activity without a game. That doesn't mean that they're not valuable, but these are some of the things that you may be facing in implementing a game. Finally, you may also have challenges around the kinds of resources, both physical, where you might need to have a student do that game, virtual resources, and even just continued access to that particular game, particularly if it's a third-party game, may be challenging. So just knowing that before you go look to implement games will be really important. Now, I encourage you to make sure that you get lots of external support when you're doing games. Parents can be challenging with this because they can sometimes think that that's all about play and what is my student really learning. So really making sure that you're helping parents understand why students are doing a particular game, particularly if they play it over time, why you've used it in your class, and helping your school and even district understand that. Because like I said, sometimes it can look like play when it's really about the lesson, and that's the most enriching and valuable way to teach that particular lesson. Now, there's a couple tips if you want to create your own games. Let's say finding games or making sure students have access to online games can be challenging for you, depending on your resources. You can do some of your own at-home gamifying. Just add things to lessons like points or levels, or have a leaderboard. Perhaps students are working through a project that has multiple stages, and they're doing that independently. Check off on a leaderboard very visible in your online classroom of how far students are working, or what have they done, or how are they advancing. Or if you don't want to have a leaderboard because you don't want to encourage too much competition in your class, you can have students have their own way to check their progress and to see their growth and to get personal badges even as they're working through various stages. Badging is a great way to do your own gamifying, particularly in a virtual space, and many of the learning management systems and virtual learning environments have integrated badging tools, so students can just be individually rewarded or can choose to be publicly rewarded as they're working through activities. The nice thing about do-it-yourself gaming is it's adaptive. It helps students learn and grow and path as they're working through their experiences when created well. Now, when you're trying to do some of your at-home gamifying, you probably want to think about doing things that could feel like a game, right? So not just gamifying a lesson where each student needs to read and reflect on something. Maybe you want to gamify something more like a scavenger hunt, a virtual scavenger hunt, or that role play that we've discussed in discussion forums, or even projects that have stages or drafts involved in them. Something that's a little more complex and more active is best to align to a do-it-yourself game or using gamifying approaches. And like I said before, you may want to think about creating daily and weekly leaderboards or rankings or ways for students to see status just in time, either individually or publicly, depending on how you want to set that up. Even prizes instead of badges can be a great way to acknowledge students as they're working through their learning. And then finally, you want to be thinking about how you can adapt this so that students are having as many opportunities to grasp concepts as possible. So if a student struggles the first time with a concept, build into your game where they should go next. So not every student's path is going to be the same. That's complex to set up from a gamifying and just a content perspective, but once you set it up, particularly in a virtual environment, it can really help students personalize the learning experience, and it can be way more effective in them reaching the outcomes you desire. Now let's think a little bit about gamifying and games and gamification in education. Now let's hypothetically say that you're actually going to try to implement some of these approaches, but you're really concerned at what parents may say. How would you help them understand? So create a particular lesson or activity that you're going to gamify, and how would you help parents understand that that's actually a positive experience? Or what kind of data would you collect to evaluate that experience to make sure it was having the kind of positive impact you would like?